We're now going to look at another way that ROSI can drive value, which is through circularity in supply chains. So to moderate this panel, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Chisara Ehiemere, who is our senior research scholar here at CSB for ROSI. Chisara has over 20 years of hands-on experience optimizing sustainable supply chains and sourcing strategies. Welcome, Chisara, and I'll let you introduce your panel.
So hi, everyone. My name is Chisara Ehiemere, and I'm the Senior Research Lead for Return on Sustainability Investment here at CSB. And we're going to switch gears a little bit at this time, and we're going to look at some of that midstream, which we heard a little bit about in the agricultural context, but we're going to be looking at it in the manufacturing context, and then also have the opportunity to look at packaging. And in both cases, we'll be looking at circularity and how ROSI, or the Return on Sustainability Investment framework and methodology, can be used to identify value and can create enterprise value for companies. And so we have two panelists here that are going to dig into some details around the hows of ROSI over the next few minutes. And first, we have Tristan Steichen, who's the Executive Director of the National Lubricant Container Recycling Coalition. So we'll get to have a perspective on a pre-competitive collaboration and see a bit about how that works. And then we also have Kathya Mahadevan, who is the Senior Sustainability Leader for the Circular Economy at Owens Corning. And so we'll get started. I'll actually start with you, Kathya, and I'll have you please introduce yourself and tell us a little about your role and the circularity problem that you are, or multiple problems that you are seeking to solve within your role and within Owens Corning.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for having me here. So I lead strategy and the integration of our actions through the circular economy team across the enterprise. So Owens Corning is a building materials company. We're headquartered in Toledo, Ohio, and so I'm here from Ohio. And we have a number of aspirations which we have declared. And a key aspiration for us is to reduce the impact of our operations through the elimination of waste. So we have a declared goal of getting to zero by 2030, so zero waste to landfill by 2030. And from a circular economy standpoint, we are driving the development of business models, and we're doing it through essentially three routes. One, through the increase of recycled content in our product and consistently reducing or eliminating raw materials. Two, through the reuse and recycle of our products when they are no longer, at the end of life, when they're no longer beneficially used for what they were intended. And three, through the collaboration up and down our supply chain with our customers, et cetera. So Owens Corning, just a brief background, we operate three businesses, three distinct businesses that build a number of different types of products. We have our roofing business, which manufactures shingles. So we have roofing and asphalt. It's an integrated operation. We do insulation, so insulation in your walls. So you might recognize the pink insulation. If you've ever looked inside your wall cavity, that's us. Or you walk through, Lowe's or Home Depot and you see the Pink Panther, that's us. And then composites, and we supply glass fiber composite materials that go into a number of different applications, including sustainability applications. So wind blades, we supply our glass fiber composite materials to wind blades to make them lighter, so on and so forth. We operate over 100 facilities across the world, and to achieve our aspirations, we have to engage in a lot of development and deployment of different sustainability solutions. And so we needed to essentially look at a methodology to derive value, to make some prioritization regarding some of our strategic actions. and to be able to also communicate it across the enterprise that sustainability has business value. And one of the key focuses is we are moving from sort of, this goal setting exercise to operationalizing sustainability, which means that we that we have to embed it across our businesses. So the ROSI framework was something that we were very interested in it because it allowed us to demonstrate the interconnected benefits and to be able to demonstrate the value across a number of functions of our business, which then allowed us to sort of demonstrate how we could embed sustainability and deliver value to the organization.
Great. Thank you so much for that overview of your work. And so we know more about construction materials maybe than we thought with the Pink Panther.
Yeah, that's right.
And so just switching gears slightly to talk to you, Tristan, we heard from Kathya kind of more of an internal company perspective, and so would love to hear more about your role and the circularity problem that you seek to solve, and really how you came about and how the partners got together.
Sure. So my name is Tristan. I actually am a consultant with SWCA, and we have a lot of clients in the petroleum space, particularly in this case in the petroleum lubricants area. One of the other things that we do is part of our services is to identify collaborations or collective actions to have a group of stakeholders come together and solve a unique and very specific problem. And in this case, about 4 to 5 years ago, right during the pandemic, we were putting together a program that involved major producers of lubricants, packaging companies, collectors, waste haulers, recyclers, everyone from the value chain to very simply put together a solution to collect and recycle the packaging associated with the products. So this is a very packaging specific coalition because the challenges with petroleum packaging, and you see similar issues with paint industry, pesticides, herbicides industry, we call dirty packaging or hard to recycle packaging. This material is traditionally landfilled. It doesn't comply or fit into a blue bin or curbside recycling. So we had to come up with an alternative solution to address this. And there are various models and programs that exist in Europe and Canada and other places. But our objective was to build a solution for recovery and recycling of this packaging. Soon later, it became an evolution into focusing on circularity very specifically. Also, over the past 4 years, there's been regulation around extended producer responsibility, EPR. So the requirement by state governments to hold producers accountable for the investment in recovery and recycling of their packaging specifically. 4 states have done it, and the expectation is that's going to continue. So what we've done is, the challenge here is to recognizing the difficulty in recycling this material, the costs associated with that, and the risks associated with recycling this material is going to be substantial. And so what we were looking at doing is leveraging the ROSI process and monetizing the impacts of that. What solution could we come up with to address this? And the solution was a collaborative, independent system of basically an infrastructure that collects and recycles this material outside of existing recycling chains. And so bringing a group of peers and competitors together, as well as their value chain, let's just say it's very, very challenging from a consultant standpoint to get everybody to move in the same direction, but that's where we're headed, and that's what we monetized.
Great, thank you. And a little bit later, you can talk to us about how you went about the monetization process. But I'd love to go back to you, Kathya, and hear more about the process. You talked about having multiple departments being involved in this process. So how did you bring these multiple departments together and embark upon the ROSI process?
Sure. So I guess the first thing in such a transformation process from my standpoint was to break down the enormity of the problem into a small bite-sized project that we could execute and start with a pilot. So after internal discussions, with our chief sustainability officer, we settled on the fact that we should conduct a pilot to assess the impact, the value of our strategies to get to zero waste to landfill at a plant in the US. So we chose our Newark, Ohio plant, which is a fiberglass insulation plant. So once we actually made that decision, I guess the key element was to engage with finance and to make sure that they were aligned with the framework as well as the assessment, because we wanted them to see the value in the outcome and see how we could potentially transform how we evaluate and value sustainability investments going forward. And so sponsored by the CSO and supported by the VP of the Insulation Finance Division, we brought a team that included finance folks as well as our sustainability folks to participate in the project. So step one after that really was essentially educating folks, in the business, in marketing and sales, as well as in sustainability on what the ROSI approach was, and getting all these stakeholders engaged in the fact that this is really what we were trying to do. And so once we actually did that and we started executing the project, we moved forward with identifying stakeholders all across operations, sales and marketing, both a legal, risk, internal in the United States, as well as our European colleagues, to just sort of have a more global perspective of the things that might impact installation, not just in the US, but globally, so the model can kind of account for that. And so that really was the process. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing up the fact that there was engagement with Europe just to be able to kind of act as a proxy for a looking glass for where the US may be going in terms of legislation.
Yep.
So thank you. And so Tristan, how did the process differ for you, given that you're dealing with multiple companies at different parts of the value chain and really trying to break down the solution and identify what some of those benefits would be along the way?
Yeah, so it's the challenge here is obviously with the data, and the data has to be collected directly from the stakeholders and from the, in this case, primarily the 5 major lubricant producers. And we were going through the ROSI process of the data collection. They weren't too aware of it because our contacts were either sustainability folks, sometimes procurement folks, sometimes finance folks. But what we were trying to do is get access to their distribution data. So there's thousands of SKUs that they're sending out, thousands of products, and the biggest challenge they had was understanding where their distribution is going. Because I think there were some conversations earlier today about Walmart and retail. So once the product is produced and it's delivered to your customer, that distribution chain expands very quickly, and they keep that information very confidential. So the process of trying to understand what their distribution chain was and then calculate that back to a cost per material, whether it's plastic, whether it's metal, whether it's paper, it was normalizing that data amongst a large array. And then also getting these various producers to come together and agree that, all right, we have antitrust that we have to protect, but let's all agree on what our market share represents. So what we were trying to do is measure the impact across the entire industry. So you took that impact across the entire industry, looking at that impact of EPR, and then how did the solution benefit from it? So the collection involved accessing multiple people within each of those organizations, then getting them to come together and agree on what the market share actually represented, which was challenging.
Sounds really easy, right? Yeah, and so I think that, and then the added complexity you said of the making sure that there was no antitrust
Yeah,
strategies?
so they're not, so you're having individual conversations with each producer, you're collecting their data, then you're getting it from all the others, aggregating it together and say, all right, guys, this is what we're estimating the market to be based on these assumptions. And you would do that collectively. So they would obviously know their contribution to it, but they wouldn't know what the others were. It's sort of a blind benchmarking, for lack of a better phrase.
Great, thank you. And so, Kathya, if you could talk a little bit more about how data collection occurred, and yes, this was on a smaller scale, but we know that this was also quite complex, just in terms of the where the data lived within the different departments and locations within Owens Corning. So, could you share with us how you went about doing that?
Sure. I guess maybe I can just explain for a moment the smaller scale that we're talking about. It is, I guess, the largest fiberglass production plant for us in North America. So from a volume standpoint and a revenue standpoint, it does account for probably, it is a significant, plant for Owens Corning. And also with regard to the complexity of the volume of waste that's, and the type of waste that's generated at that plant, we would need to deploy a number of different strategies. And so the strategies included diverting the waste away from landfill through reuse and recycle to external parties. It looked at strategies of deploying recycling technology to internally recycle it back to raw material form. It looked at a variety of different strategies associated with other scrap reduction and productivity increase techniques and so on and so forth. So with regard to the data associated with it, what we try to do is bring together a cross-functional team of individuals within the plant, within our, within operations, within the Center of Excellence, the R&D teams. And so I served as a single point of contact, and once we identified what benefits we were going to essentially monetize, then it was working with those individuals in a cross-functional manner to identify and collect the data. Obviously, data, in some cases we required, we didn't have that data. In that case, we were then looking for the closest proxy, and then, working with the NYU team to kind of make that determination based on kind of what the market was saying. So, yeah.
Thank you. And Tristan, I guess going back to you with the circularity. So you've collected all of this data, you understand the market share for each of the players, and then you're trying to determine the type of practices that would be needed to be able to set up a circular system that would collect and be able to recycle these products. And then also, though, be able to communicate to each partner what their contribution would need to be. So how did you go about doing that?
Yeah, the process of just collecting the data and then having everyone agree to it holistically, what the total impact was, that actually made it easy. So once you had the very big picture on total market impact, and I think that, the forecast that we had was the risk to the industry over the next 10 years can, by the end of the decade, I think it was $400 million per year in fees. And so you could very clearly model and project that out, knowing each individual company's contribution to that, showing their specific data set relative to the rest of the market was easy. And so from that, we were able to sort of create both a industry-wide and a contributors or a producer-wide forecast, and then sort of communicate that business plan internally. And that, that was one of the things that took a lot, because, you had to educate one and then educate another and sort of walk it through the organization. But I mean, the benefit of it was somewhere around 3 to 4x in cost savings. So it was pretty significant.
Thank you. And so, Kathya, I guess for you, I know we went through you went through the process, identified the benefits, monetized the benefits, and then had to get kind of buy-in from the rest of the organization. And I know some of for example, you mentioned EPR fees or potential EPR fees and changing legislation. How were you able to think about risks of changing legislation without knowing what was coming down, what's going to be happening? And I know you mentioned a bit about Europe. Were there other ways that you were able to think about some of those unknowns or more intangibles?
Yeah, certainly. So, I think there's a general sort of belief that Europe will lead the way, and ultimately we will follow. And so we certainly did look at changing regulations that have impacted us in Europe, and sort of looked at how that could potentially, be relevant to us in the U.S. And so, that was certainly one way in which we looked at regulatory risk. I think we also looked at regulatory risk from some of the impacts that have occurred to us as we operate our plants in the U.S. and mitigation strategies that we've adopted, and looked at kind of like how potentially that could be a future challenge for us. And so really those were, the two ways that we looked at regulatory risk yeah.
Another question, and this is for you as well, Kathya. We've seen data, information, and analysis on our Sustainable Market Share Index, which is for CPG. It's more kind of consumer-facing, and we see in that data that there is interest to purchase and ability or interest in paying more in some cases. And so when you're sitting where you sit, in the value chain, I imagine, and we know from experience that it's a little bit more challenging. So what might be some of the recommendations that you have for different ways to be able to look at that, even if you don't have the kind of Sustainable Market Share Index data to go off of?
Sure. So, we are a leading sustainable building materials company. So, we're recognized and for our recycled content within our products right now, and so certainly that continues to be our driving force. With regard to the markets that we serve, we are always looking at our customers' requirements and the changing customer requirements that are sustainability driven, but also product performance driven, and we're trying to integrate both product performance, the customer requirements, as well as our sustainability aspirations, and aligning that also with their goals in order to deliver a superior product. And so we do look at where our customers are going. Our sales and marketing folks are actively always engaged in those conversations. The sustainability group is always tracking regulatory changes and regulatory pressures. And so we have some cross-functional collaboration that occurs between the business and the corporate sustainability group in order to exchange information as it relates to that and make some determinations as to where and how the market's going to move. Yeah.
And so for Tristan, since you mentioned having the supply chain at the table, does that make that any easier, or is it just as complex and involve some estimation?
Well, it certainly adds a layer of complexity, but I think having the supply chain adds incredible value because you're not making decisions based on sort of a limited perspective. You're engaging them in the conversation. So the industry right now, and from a packaging perspective, uses about 25% recycled content, PCR, post-consumer recycled content. So working with the compounders, the companies that make the packaging, and where they're sourcing that material, and how would a piece of legislation like EPR or PCR and increases in that affect the supply chain is significant. So I think the recycling rate in the US is pretty crummy, around 8%. So what if you were to double or triple that recycling rate as a result of EPR? What do you think what would happen to the amount of available recycled material in the market? It would skyrocket. And so if you can work with various members of the supply chain and begin to talk about design and ways that you can change your packaging design such that you can start to leverage and use that, so you're truly talking about circular packaging, that's a huge lift. And a producer, a brand owner can't do that alone. It has to involve the supply chain.
Great. And so something for both of you, because we have talked about marketing, and so being able to communicate. Are your efforts communicated to consumers, obviously to your customers as well, but what types of efforts do your members, for example, after investing all of this time and energy into the process of being a part of this, is this something that they communicate about? And I can start with you, Tristan. And then
Sure. I mean, so everything that we do on behalf of our members, we communicate. We're very transparent about the activities that we do. We're finishing up, we've done a pilot study that focuses on the collection and recycling materials in a market. We'll be putting that out. We've actually formed a NGO that focuses specifically on solving the recyclability solution amongst the brand owners. So we're going to be very transparent about that piece of it. What they do then is they'll take that messaging and amplify it. And with any EPR program or anything like this, there is a huge consumer education and awareness component to it. So that's all part and parcel. Right now, we just got to get our ducks in a row about how this is actually going to work, because you can imagine the infrastructure investment to make something like this successful.
Right, and then Kathya, I guess because you would be communicating to customers, I know there are certifications and transparency around recycled content, so just curious how that communication occurs.
Yeah, so I mean, we're publishing our sustainability report for the 18th year right now. So, you know, we are committed to transparency. And so a lot of the information regarding kind of how we're doing against the various goals, as well as product compliance, et cetera, is documented within our report and some of the partnerships that we're, you know, associated with. And then, of course, we do have, you know, the certifications and other, you know, requirements in order to be able to sell our products. And again, all of that is, you know, available on our website. So if someone wanted to go and look up, you know, insulation and the recycled content claims on, you know, on our product, you could do so. Yeah.
Great. One last question, or close to the last question I have, is just around risks of doing nothing. I know that when we went through the analysis, we look at business as usual and then compare that to a more sustainable future and what that would look like. We've also heard just the risk of doing nothing, the cost of inaction. And so just curious for both of you, the role that understanding that plays in your analysis and any insight that you might have. And Kathya, you can start.
Sure. I mean, we did consider the risk of inaction within the ROSI model. We considered it in terms of risk of market share loss, because, you know, there may be more sustainable products that emerge into the marketplace that we may need to compete against. So, you know, obviously, I think that, I think Tansi had a slide where, you know, risk and all the different categories of risk were identified. And so we did consider that from our perspective. And then, you know, like I already said, you know, Europe is leading the way. So we already see those transformations occurring in Europe. And so, you know, the risk of inaction from a regulatory standpoint, I guess there's a stark comparison between what's in the US and what's in Europe. And so we certainly did consider that as well.
Anything to add from your perspective, Tristan, before we open up?
Sure. Yeah, the risks of inaction are, well, we've got plenty of examples, whether it's Canada or Europe or other places that already have EPR legislation. The risks of inaction is you can't sell your product. So banning is the risk. So is it something you even bother quantifying, that you're out of business in terms of selling that product? So no, you don't do that. And quite frankly, there's, you know, one of the states is California, and they hang this ridiculous $50,000 a day per infraction fine. And it's kind of, all right, you're going to quantify that? No. So I think we looked at various sort of costs of inaction scenarios, and mostly it was the more proactive you are to address these types of issues, that's where your benefit really comes in versus waiting to the last minute and then doing something. We've quantified that actually creates greater risk as well. So there was no true do nothing wasn't an option. It was how do we get creative with the options that we have, and this business model entity was the solution.
Great, thank you both so much. And at this point, I will open up for questions. I was going to clap at the end. Any questions? We have.
Hi, Eric Tucker, Impact Alternatives and Silverleaf Partners. So for Tristan, first of all, I think it's great that you have these kinds of coalitions. It makes so much sense. As you mentioned, you're getting in front of legislation that might be regulation that might be inefficient. And I've always thought that if industries police themselves, it's a lot better. So just any insights on how this all came together? Are you in touch with other recycling coalitions for other industries? It seems like you have a pretty tight industry, so it's any kind of resistance that you got, and any insights that might inform. And just also on lubricants, there must be a lot of industrial commercial users versus retail. Any comparisons there? Thanks.
Yeah, so I won't get into the product itself because there's a lot more product that gets distributed outside of commercial and packaging that does in it. So let's focusing on the packaging piece. I think what was most interesting is, you're going to differentiate yourself from a sustainability perspective on the product side. But once packaging material goes post-consumer, there is no differentiation. A single company, even as big as some of those large petroleum companies, isn't going to move the needle. So a recognition that you have to collaborate on the back end post-consumer when it comes to waste is the only way it's going to work. And we've seen other examples of this in the paint and coatings industry. We're working with them. I think I mentioned pesticides and herbicides as well, but so there are other industries. I think any industry could benefit from this, whether it's food and beverage, the restaurant industry, collaborating on solutions where you're impacting the market and the consumer when it comes to waste seems to be the most effective. It's just getting them in a room, educating them how to do it, and then it starts to make sense. It takes time, but it makes sense.
Other questions? Oh, we have one here in the front and then two on the side.
Hi, Eric Maidenberg here. I'm happy to be back in my alma mater too, which is great.
Back.
After many years. Tristan, question for you. So EPR, seemingly in Europe, you have a lot more sort of starting from an EU commission and then sort of proliferating across countries. In the United States, obviously, it's not as simple, and you talked about 4 states or 5 with an asterisk on what they're actually doing. But what motivates companies, if you're only dealing with 4 states, company doesn't want to comply or doesn't want to get involved, then you move from one state to another, and you kind of move past that. That's obviously not a good thing. But is there a way that you see going from the cost of inaction to the benefit of action? Do you see a profitability angle? Is there a incentive that gets companies to say, you know what, there is a real, other than going from quarterly earnings and, which of course we know is going to be problematic because sometimes it costs more in the short run, but the cost of inaction eventually go out of business, right? But are there other ways to incentivize companies because it's a doing good is good business model that you're seeing?
Always. There's always that case. I think the biggest challenge, it's not in the big brands that seems to be driving it. It's in the smaller brands that have less influence, or you go from a global multinational, but then you get to regional providers. It's that area that I think is the bigger challenge. And I think that what we're seeing on the larger multinationals is a desire to support that group. Even though they're competitors, I see a desire to support that group because let's face it, they don't have the best reputation from a sustainability perspective. So there's a benefit in collaboration, not just amongst the big dogs, but engaging the others. And when you're talking about the states, that's going to continue. Every year, I think there was at least 10 to a dozen states that introduced EPR this year. It's probably not going to happen this year because it's an election year. We all know that. But this isn't going to stop. And you can map out where it's going to happen next, most likely. But yeah.
We had one here on the, oh, okay. Then we can come back over.
Hi, Phil Rabat from Advanced Six. You know, you hinted at the big infrastructure investments that would be necessary to recycle these lubricant packages. And can you talk a little bit about how the risk gets shared vertically in those value chains? Because I imagine there are multiple players, from like an advanced recycler at the beginning and, you know, multiple people along the chain back to the plastic bottle. And, you know, my experience has been it's hard. One of those dominoes, if it refuses to fall, the whole thing gets hard. So how do you get those cats herded?
We have a really good test case north of the border in Canada. They've been running this program for an oil, antifreeze, and packaging collection program. Their recycling rate is 92%. So, and the way that program works is it's incentive-based. You don't actually go out and build recycling plants or build collections. You create an incentive to the market, a financial incentive. I will pay this recycler X cents a pound that they can show me they collected. So you're incentivizing the market through fees. That's how your fees get collected. So your cash flow is you're taking fees from the brand owners, and you're taking those fees and you're offering a fee to the market. And so the market responds competitively to pay those or to collect that material, document that collection. So there are players out there. There's already mechanical recyclers that will take this material. There's certainly chemical recyclers that will. We've already worked with some of those. And we know there's haulers. Those that haul the lubricant are also willing to add this if they can be incentivized. This is the incentive. This program creates that incentive for them to do it. And we know it works because we've seen it work. So we've got a good model.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one last, or did you want to add anything? No?
No.
Okay. Do we have time for one last one? Because I saw a couple more. Okay, one last one. There you go. And then you can all go for lunch.
Hi, Judy Artashkar. Thank you for all your insight. The two of you have mentioned that data is essential. Are you looking at using AI already? Because it looks like it's easy to gather data, share the information that can feed back, and then feed it to your supply chains.
I think eventually, perhaps, there would be an application for AI, but the collection process for data still today requires measurement and traceability. And so, you know, we have a good repository of information, so you can probably think to use AI on that. But in order to actually report data, and because of the auditing requirements and so on and so forth, of the traceability that you require, we expect that there would be some manual, you know, interventions and not purely AI-based. But that's, you know, it'll be determining based on how AI also evolves, I guess, going into the future.
Yeah, and we looked at that too, but it's a question of reliability of the data, and there's no substitute for hard data based on actual distribution, actual packaging weights. So the tried and true method works the best.
Awesome. Thanks so
So
much.
thank you. Great panel.